We're here today for Kath's final candidature review. Kath has been one of our part-time students and has done this while becoming a mother and having all the joys and ups and downs of having a little one. It's been a long slog. We're getting there. So.
Thanks.
We've got Rhonda joining us by phone. We have our guest, Justin over there, who's a co-supervisor. He's an occupational therapist. So, Kath, you ready?
I am.
Okay, take it away.
Thank you.
The
clicker, of course. Thanks, John. Okay, so before I start, today we acknowledge and pay our respects to the First Peoples, the traditional custodians of the land and waterways, the Gurungai people, and thank them for their continued hospitality. We acknowledge and celebrate the continuation of a living culture that has a unique role in this region, and we also acknowledge elders past and present, as well as our emerging leaders of tomorrow, and thank them for their wisdom and guidance as we walk in their footsteps. So thank you for coming to my final year presentation today. So my project is about occupational therapy assessment and Aboriginal people, but specifically in the clinical area of mental health. So to start off with, basic explanation of what occupational therapists do. So occupational therapists, we work in a variety of settings, from paediatrics to mental health to neuro to rehabilitation post-stroke. Really, OTs think about, well, they ask the question, not what is the matter with you, but what matters to you. So we look at what are the limitations that the diagnosis, the illness or the condition places on the individual, and we work with them to figure out ways around that so the person can complete the tasks and the tasks associated with the roles that are important to that individual. So limitations can be temporary, say post-hip surgery, an OT might prescribe a piece of equipment so that the person may be able to still toilet and self-care independently. For us in the mental health setting, and particularly in the inpatient setting, we're looking at the limitations imposed by treatment-resistant forms of schizophrenia or chronic schizophrenia. And those particular limitations are around cognitive deficits. So memories of problems of memory, problem-solving, thinking, and organisation. And those kinds of problems can get in the way of a person's ability to work, to socialise, to budget, to use public transport, to do all the things that we kind of need to do every day to fulfil our life roles. So I'm going to talk to you about a clinical scenario now, which really highlighted to me the gap in the current literature and research within occupational therapy, but I think also gives you an idea about what we as occupational therapists do in the mental health setting. So the scenario is that I was working on an inpatient psychiatric unit. An Aboriginal gentleman was admitted to the unit, and he'd been admitted several times recently, and the welfare officer on the unit, who goes and kind of assists people to buy small items, clothing, things that they need when they're admitted to hospital, said to me, Kath, this gentleman has presented to hospital again with no shoes. Every time he comes in, I help him to go and purchase a new pair, and he's been admitted again and he's got no shoes. I don't think he's coping very well out there. He's not able to look after himself. So she comes to me because that's what I do as an OT. I assess the person's ability to perform those important tasks. So I went and spoke to this gentleman and I said, well, you know, what's going on? How come you're kind of coming in every time with no shoes? Can you tell me a bit about that? And what he said is actually that he gives those shoes away usually because that's an important part of his role as a young man in his community, to share resources and to give things away like new shoes to kind of more senior members in the community. So that really highlighted to me, well, if I was an OT and I was going to assess this gentleman and I wasn't aware of some of the cultural aspects or what makes, you know, good functioning for this gentleman within his community, within his social kind of milieu, that I might actually assess him as functioning really poorly. And so the subsequent clinical interventions would be incorrect and would probably lead to poor outcomes for this guy. So at the moment it kind of depends on the OT you see, how well attuned they are to those cultural issues, and whether they're assessing people through their own cultural filter or not. So I went to, first of all, the aim of the project is to produce an assessment guideline that OTs can use as part of their usual assessment processes in the clinical area of mental health. So the literature, what does the literature say? Well, there's not, in my experience of an OT of 15 years experience, I didn't come across really any literature, specifically in the mental health setting, about how we can conduct assessment in a culturally inclusive way with Aboriginal people. There are some general guidelines that OTs can use, whichever the clinical setting that they work in, about how to build rapport, general sort of communication guidelines, things like that. But anything more specific, some really more tangible strategies, techniques, assessment methods, there really isn't any available. And so at the same time, the statistics for ill health within the Aboriginal population in Australia is significantly poorer than the rest of the population. So there is I think, a really big obligation for health professionals, for all the health professions, to make some contribution towards improving those statistics. And the outcome of my research is for OT to make some contribution to hopefully improving those statistics of Aboriginal mental health. So within the relatively small amount of literature that was available, there was some evidence that OTs have, that there are some OTs who have developed culturally inclusive ways of working, culturally inclusive ways of assessment, just through practical experience. So in their clinical experience, they've just developed more inclusive ways of engagement, more inclusive ways of conducting and writing their results of assessment, and also the way that they conduct their clinical interventions. There was also one study by Nelson, that was a study of about 30 OTs at a national conference, that said the majority of that small sample group felt that they ought to be working in a more culturally inclusive way with Aboriginal people, but they just weren't sure how to do it. So I began to think, well, I think that the majority of OTs out there, that's probably true for the majority of OTs out there, that we feel like we would like to be working in more culturally inclusive ways, but we just really don't know how to do that. So to summarise the hypotheses of the entire research project, the idea of study one is to gauge how many OTs in the study sample really feel like they would like to be working in a culturally inclusive way but don't know how to do that. And also how many OTs have actually feel confident in the way that they work with Aboriginal people, to see what the proportion was in that study sample. The idea of study two is to talk to those OTs who indicated that they do feel confident in their skills in working with Aboriginal people in a culturally inclusive way, to gather the themes, the content and the data, and to refine those concepts and put them into the guideline assessment that will be developed as part of study 3. And for study 3 to be a Delphi study, so that it is sent out to OTs, to Aboriginal health workers as cultural experts, and to Aboriginal OTs as well, to make sure that the guideline assessment meets the cultural validity, but also that it incorporates everything that an OT assessment really should do, that's within our scope of practice as OTs. So this is a qualitative research project, so it's important for me to describe my stance as a researcher, because the data really it's gathered by me and it's filtered through me as a researcher, so it's important to state my perspective. So the epistemology that I'm coming from with this research project is constructionism. So particularly in study 2, constructionism is about working with research participants to create new knowledge. And this is certainly true, particularly in study 2, where I'm interviewing people, talking with them, and helping them to explore those strategies that they use that make them feel confident in working with Aboriginal people in an inclusive way, and to really explore those ideas. What are those techniques and why have they developed them? And also in study 3, it's about exploring those ideas and those concepts. So I'm working with participants to create that new knowledge. The theoretical perspective that I'm using as a researcher in this project is interpretivism, and interpretivism is really about, again, exploring with people what ideas and what is guiding their practice. So for those OTs in study 2 who have developed more inclusive ways of practice, what are the perspectives, the ideas, things from their experience that have guided those new ways of working? So the methodology. Okay. So the methodology that I've chosen is the grounded theory methodology, and that is about developing new concepts from the data and constantly testing those new concepts throughout the research process. So within study 2, data the concepts are actually developed within the interviews. There's semi-structured interviews, so that gives me as a researcher some breadth to be able to explore concepts as they come up in the interviews, and also to kind of test and retest those concepts as I go through the interview process. But again, the concepts that are extracted from the data of study 1 and study 2 are tested, that they are true for all the participants within the Delphi study for study 3. So that's kind of in a nutshell. We'll talk about that for a lot longer, but so moving on to the method. So the method, the project has 3 studies. Study 1 is an interview, is a survey, sorry. The aim was for 100 participants for study 1, working across various clinical areas. So not just mental health, in all clinical areas that OTs work in, but also in all geographical areas. It was important to get OTs from metropolitan, regional and remote settings to make sure that the results of this research could be applicable with Aboriginal people, depending on where they're living, whether it's regional, metropolitan or remote. And really the idea of this project was to gauge how many OTs do feel confident in their skills working with Aboriginal people inclusively, how many don't, and to really also find out from those OTs who really don't feel confident in their skills, why that is. How is it that there's not enough resources within the profession, or is it that they haven't got experience? Why is it that they feel that they have that gap in their skills and their knowledge? So study 2 will be inviting those participants in study 1 who do feel confident in their skills to conduct their assessments, interventions in a culturally inclusive way, and to get more depth of information about why that is. Why do they feel that they do feel confident? What are the techniques that they've developed, and what's the reasoning behind that? Why do they use a particular technique? How do they feel that that's more effective, and what's the evidence for that? Okay, and study 3, as I said, is about combining the results from study 1 and study 2 from those people who do feel confident in their techniques, strategies, ways of assessing Aboriginal people in an inclusive way, and putting that into an assessment guideline document. It won't be a standardised assessment, and this is a really important point to make, because every person is different, every person who is an Aboriginal person is different. Using a formulaic kind of assessment on every person, that wouldn't work, because some of these ideas and concepts might not apply to every person. It's more of the assessment guideline will be more of a prompt or something that sits along usual assessment processes to say, look, this is potentially something that you should consider when you're working with an Aboriginal person. You know, this may apply to them, this may not apply to them, but just keep it in mind. And so the comments will be, so the assessment guideline as part of the Delphi study will be sent out to OTs, to Aboriginal OTs and to Aboriginal health workers. And as I said before, that's about making sure that the assessment guideline is relevant and includes everything from the perspective of those different stakeholders. That it's a comprehensive kind of assessment form from an OT perspective, and then it's also very culturally inclusive. So the results for study 1. So we ended up getting 102 participants for study 1 for the survey. And just thinking back to the hypothesis that I sort of mentioned earlier, that the majority of OTs will feel the need to work culturally inclusively, but don't know how. So 89 OTs believe that they need to change the way they conduct assessment, but only 24 are confident in their ability to do that. 87 participants felt that they need to change the way they conduct interventions, but only 29 were confident in their ability to do this in a culturally inclusive way. And 58 participants believe that there is a need to change the way they write reports, and only 10 felt confident to do this in a culturally inclusive way. So I think that really supports that hypothesis for study 1, that, and I think highlights the gap that this assessment guideline will go some way to filling. That OTs will be able to have some kind of a guideline, something a bit more tangible that will help them feel they're working in a more culturally inclusive way. Some of the themes that emerged from the open-ended questions, to kind of summarise the 3 sort of most common themes that OTs who felt that lack of confidence was a lack of education and training available to them. The second most common theme was a lack of culturally inclusive assessment techniques for delivering interventions and assessments. And the third most common theme was how supportive the organisation they worked for was in supporting them to work in culturally inclusive ways. So some participants mentioned that, you know, the more flexible the workplace, the less pressure to see more people, allowing them more time to spend with their Aboriginal consumers of their service, really helped them feel like they were working in a more culturally inclusive way. So it's kind of like more organisational sort of issues. So the study 2, so the structured interviews for study 2. So there's 4 been undertaken so far. Again, this study was about getting information from those OTs who do feel confident in their skills in working culturally inclusively. So those things are starting to be explored in more depth in study 2. So describing more about the level of organisational support. The impact of trauma was a really common theme that's come through so far. Knowing common impacts of trauma and how that affects someone's functioning, but also maybe some sources of trauma that are common to people from the community that person comes from. So having an awareness of some of the local issues of the community that person comes from and identifies with is really, really important. The importance of communication using local language where it's appropriate, local jargon. Most of the participants have mentioned that. And working with families, including families in the assessment, clinical intervention planning process is really important. And also working with Aboriginal health workers, so including Aboriginal health workers actively in the clinical process, the assessment process and the intervention process to build rapport, get better quality information from assessments and generally create better outcomes of service. So at this stage, this is the timeline for completion, looking at July of next year to complete so all of the 3 studies and completing the thesis. So they're my references, and that's that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.